Hi, I'm Sky High Phoenix, a game developer and student at the University of Portsmouth, studying for a specialism in game design. And this is another entry into my game development diary. Namely, this is a retrospective look at Game Jam 3 for my game development module. Now, for this one, again, starting as always, let's look at the brief. In this case, 4 weeks, 6 people, a platformer, and the big thing this time, there's an expo at the point of hand in. Now, for this one, I seemed a bit more hopeful with my team, I'm going to be honest. And also, with the fact that there's the expo at the end, the hope was that, people might actually be motivated, including myself, to ensure that we have a thing to show off and something that can be played at the point of the expo. So, again, the other thing here that I had to consider was don't set my expectation too high. That was something I mentioned in both of my previous retrospectives for game jams, but for this one I sort of came in partially understanding that. Now, admittedly, the hope slightly increased from that based on the fact that we actually had the entire team show up at the start of the project. Nice little bonus. But it is one of those situations where ultimately it is still only 4 weeks. Try and set the expectations and scope accordingly. Of course, a brief is nothing if you can't do anything with it, so looking a bit at the ideation process we went through this time. Again, back to good old pencil and paper because we want to make a lot of those design decisions at the start of the project still, even though, at least in the general sense, even though some more specific ideas may come further down the line. Now, as you can see, first thing we decided on is 2D, and we're going to be using Godot as the engine for this one. That's just based on what we wanted from the coder's perspective. Once we also had some input from the artist saying, no, we want to do 2D for the art, then coders selected, let's go Godot then, is probably going to be the thing that provides the most flexibility given their skill set. Then for us, we're looking at having it mainly horizontally scrolled towards the endpoint, rather than having it necessarily go vertically forever. And we're also looking at having some possible basic enemies in there, and by basic it is very much a thing of humanoid character that if contact, you die in the game. That is the level we're talking in terms of basic. For once, I actually am not a code designer for this thing, or a systems designer. I get to be an art designer. I actually get to spread out my experience in this case. And the first thing that I was looking at is the color palettes and the sort of environments that we're building. I had a decent, 45-minute sit down with the artist, literally just looking at color palettes alone for this thing. And in terms of the world that we sort of were talking about at the same time, well, you can see some of them already on the far side over there, but they're also listed here in terms of Mystic Forest, Battlefield in some form of castle, and then whatever the final world would be at that stage. It ended up becoming Guardian. I think it was Guardian's Rest that we went with, and then there's also the sort of tone and feel that we're going for: darker, grungier. The idea that this place has recently been ravaged by conflict, and you can also see some of the other things. So the darker browns, greens, and greys, and the blues, providing that palette that fits that feel, and then sort of the ideas of, okay, we also want some metals in there because, again, conflict, battlefield. Let's put some weapons in there, for example. And then, of course, taking this, you've got to take it into some form of better idea. So on the far side, you can see some of the things that I used, or how that got used and turned into worlds. So Mystic Forest, small sketch of that there, the dense forest and trees, and then your character is going to be very small in the end because the character is in this game spirit of the forest. But just to sort of provide that oppressive feel, the trees are massively bigger than the character. Then again, you've got the blasted fields, where instead of having these trees that are massive, it's far more about ravaged open plain and field, with then these very much still recent yet slightly overgrown, as if nature's starting to take them back in a sense, as nature's rebellion, of these different weapons and possibly some armor in there that's been left on the battlefield after the war or conflict has been won and lost. And then, whilst not explicitly written out here, there's also a little bit of, oh, maybe I want that for the castle, and something to provide the artist a very basic concept of what I'm thinking at, given the time frame. And then also a little nice ending scene around a bonfire where that is your end goal, because at the end of each level we decided that the end goal would be, okay, go light the brazier or the fireplace at the end of it. Now, I said that I'm mostly working on art, but I actually get to do design stuff this time. I actually get to, focus on design. What is this? It's almost as if I'm actually being allowed to work in a team where I get enough other people who can do their element of the task. But in this, as much as I was mainly focusing on the art side of things for this project, paper prototyping each of the levels. So, starting at the top, we have the tutorial level, or the sort of basic movement elements of the game, and some of the basic mechanics in terms of climbing up ladders and bounce pads. And then you'll see below it the second level, which is part tutorial in terms of, okay, let's add in a couple mechanics, or introduce a couple more mechanics such as the dash and enemies. And then you also get to the point of actually playing the game properly within that level as well. Beyond that, there's a couple more levels here. You'll see that for level 4, the big gimmick at the start was the leap of faith, and actually having to hold the forwards button on that thing. But there's also the other levels, so levels 5, 6 above, and then 7, 8. And then level 9 was a bit weird because we hadn't quite figured out how we wanted to end the piece until quite at the end. So there's just a little bit of nonsense that I came up with that you'll notice at the end of level 9 there's a couple of signs at the end of it. It's essentially just what I've written there to provide a little bit of extra story to fit into the world, because we've already got a lot of the environmental storytelling. Add something a bit more explicit to say that it's been considered as well. Of course, then there's the art stuff. Admittedly, one of our artists didn't show up in the end. So, as much as I was an art designer, in the end, some of this turned into just doing some art for the foreground. Namely, this lot! And you'll notice that it is very much pixel art. It isn't the most developed. I'm sure an artist could do better than me, but from the designer's perspective, trying to step in partway through week 2 to get a decent bit of the art done, you'll notice got a couple sprite sheets for the character, that it is some sort of spirit, as you can see, mainly from the little end screen thing that I have at the bottom here. You can see some of the enemies that are on some of the pillars that we have in the game that act mainly as dividers between the levels, so you can't go necessarily in all the way to the end or all the way back to the start based on where you are in the level, but just having that sort of mini level in each area. And then you've got the platforms, you've got some of the traps that can force you to restart the level. You've got the different bouncy things. Yes, that crate of gold is a bounce pad, and so is the moss. Yeah, we were still coming up with ideas at that point to fit the world. And then you've got the little braziers that you have at the end of each level, and as well, you have the signs. And the signs very much are, okay, that's just the background, let's plaster some text over the top of it. The other thing is that you won't see in this one is both the ladders, vines, and pillars, and the pillars as well. They all have two elements to them: top bit, the cap, and then the main body. And they're designed to be modular so that you can repeat the body as many times as you want to extend both the pillars and the ladders as far as needed. Just for these cases, I have just put it as part of the main asset that I'm showing off here. Now, in this case, it's some of the better art that I've done. Admittedly, when you really flesh out a concept and you're giving it a medium where it's pretty difficult to screw up what you're trying to show with pixel art. So, in that sense, I think it was good enough. Admittedly, I would have preferred to have an artist who could touch this up and sort of make it that sort of better quality that fits in with the environment that we got in the end. But for a designer who's covering for art, I think this was pretty good. And it also really just helped me understand a lot about, okay, this is the application of the color theory. This is the application of, oh, this is why I need the pixel measurements or the size of the asset. And really understanding that application of what I as a designer need to give to the artist to at least get a bare minimum amount of information across so that they can do their work. But then again, I'm a designer for this project mostly, so as much as I've done those assets, the other responsibility I have is to actually throw it all together. And taken straight from the Godot engine, here is the thing that I was working on in terms of actually going around and placing each of the bits into the world. So you'll notice the different platforms, the different balance points. You will also notice probably that, for example, let's find a decent example. At the top, in the first image, about 2/3 of the way along, there is a sign above a little platform. That platform is actually the top of a pillar. It extends downwards. It's based on the code though, so there was just a number I put in to say I need this many things below it to get it to the ground. And ultimately, going in and placing everything here, it harkens back to the paper diagrams that I showed at the start of the design section, and then actually just converting them to engine so we have a playable game. It's a nice little change of pace from the previous game jams where you actually have something which you can go in and do the second part of the design elements, where it isn't just you coming up with ideas and just then covering for someone else to make that possible. You're actually going in and actually building the game as it's meant to be and as it's been envisioned. And there's a couple more examples here, namely the other levels, and then there's also the little starting screen and end screen that I put together. I'll just give that a moment to stay on screen so that people can pause if they want to look at it in more detail. But of course, there is some other stuff to consider because, yeah, ultimately, it's a decent project. There's the source control though. And admittedly, we decided to go for something that was relatively simple, but effective in this case. Yeah, we just used a Google Drive. It's not quite as professional as I would have liked, but it works. And yes, I have redacted some information there just so that I don't dox any of my teammates. And it is just simple. Art stuff goes in the artist box, game files go in the game files. The playtesting was mainly for executable versions when we got to that stage, and then some basics about, okay, the modulation colors I assume is from the coder, and then the Team 12 PNG is just the thing that we have for the icon that pops up when the game is in window. Looking more in depth into this, you'll notice, okay, yeah, that is our version control on the far side of the screen here. You'll notice that the first 8 versions are a .j. That is because they were uploaded by our coder, Joe. And then you'll notice there's switches to .s. That's because I uploaded them, so it's .sky in this case. And it very much was a situation where we knew that only one person would be acting on the game project at any given time. So that's what really allowed us to just say, okay, we'll just do it this way. No need for GitHub or anything. We've got the version control here that we can do very simply, and particularly with the size of the game that we were going for this time, didn't need anything more complex. And sometimes it really does seem that simpler can be more effective. Looking then at the people skills, ultimately, this one was a different experience to the previous game jams that I've done with the uni. Namely, we actually had all the core skills covered this time. We had a coder, we had a designer, and we had an artist. Yeah, it would be nice to have a producer. Yeah, it would be nice to have more than one person for each of them. But in terms of the people who showed up constantly, we had all those key areas covered. So it really just helped show that things become far more viable when you have that in there. And if you're able to make that core team, then you actually have the opportunity to make decent projects. Now, of course, that comes with a balance, because it very much came a thing of, there were 3 of us that were working on the project out of the group of 6, and it became heavily reliant on that. Admittedly, we could have done better to try and encourage some of the other team members to put their shift in, but it really is a situation where it helped to rely on that core. It's just, we probably did a bit too much of that in this project. The other thing was deadline management, because we had 4 weeks. By setting certain dates in before the final deadline to ensure that we had things sorted, it really helped in this case. It wasn't something that we did in previous project, or that I've done in previous projects for this module, but for this one we had long enough that it made sense to deal with it in that sense. And the fact that we were checking in twice a week as a team, or at least the core team, just to say this is where we are with the scheduled lectures that we have, and then an individual meeting, normally midweek, just to sit down and possibly do a bit of studio time for it. It really helped. It helped maintain the pace, it helped maintain the progress, and it really just meant that where things needed to be covered, it was far clearer what needed to be, hence why I switched to the arts relatively early on and managed to get enough stuff done before the deadline. And the other thing here that's interesting that I haven't noted here is to do with the people skills of the expo. Namely, the fact that when you actually have that motivation to make a game, seeing people play it does provide a lot of reward, which in a sense provides even more motivation to do it. So whilst not necessarily a people skill for team working, the people skill of understanding your audience and getting the reward out of that, and understanding that element of it, is a skill that, or not necessarily a skill, but something that should be harnessed to help the team really ensure that progress continues, and or even just for your own motivation. Going next then to the hand-in. We actually had 2 release candidates to hand in. What is this? An actually playable game? Yes. Yes, it was. And as you can see, in the end, the credits are slightly snarky at some of the other people in the team, but in the end, it's Team 12 over 2 that made it, and the over 2 is there for a reason. And then, I mean, just actually getting to a situation where I could upload a couple release candidates and they were executable files rather than source code that was incomplete. Really, really motivating in a sense, because had this been another failure in terms of getting to that finish line, it probably would have taken a decent toll, but a nice hand in, and there's things to be learnt. Namely, 1, if you scope correctly, as we seem to in this case, and we put in the effort, a small team can ship something, which is, like, my faith in that was starting to diminish based on the previous experience. And again, with the source control, as I mentioned, sometimes simpler can pay more dividends. Similar thing with the level design. There's nothing too complex about it. There's no massive generation algorithms. It's just all preset levels. 9 of them, go play. You can limit the game to be simpler, and then be able to complete the project, and therefore completing that project will pay more dividends than not releasing the game because it was too complex. And then again, that idea of the core team within that larger, at least nominal team, ensuring that you are part of it and you're still working with the other people in that core team. Doing that means you can be more effective than necessarily just spending all your time trying to herd someone else who is showing that they don't necessarily want to put as much effort in all the time. And really working on that side of things to then get that game. And it's one of those things which seems like a negative thing, because you're, of course, that's when you can start over relying on things. But if done right, and as I learned from this one. When you have a motivated enough core whilst not overworking them, the team can output a lot more. Ultimately, Game Jam 3, comparative to the previous two, a success. Yeah, there was probably still a couple stumbling blocks, mainly by the fact that we didn't have the full team there, and there was elements which had to be covered, and again, it was simple. But now it seemed that the footing had been found, and at least in my case, I got some experience being a designer first, and then rather than necessarily covering for some other subject specialism. And then in that sense, having that base on which you can actually go in and do that work which you expect to do really means that the only way to go now is to just hone that skill. So for me, be more of the designer than necessarily someone who was coding or doing art. And again, this was the turning point for that. Ultimately, turns out there's 2 more to go, the Global Game Jam and the final project, but they're for next time, and I'll see you there.